Be me. Late 1990s. Work in a rural area of Russia as a sort of ranger or wildlife preservationist. In Russia, we don't have the same regulations and strict protocols as some of you might. We more or less just drive around on ATVs and berate poachers while we ensure the safety of the deer population and shit like that. I worked in a rural area, surrounded by forest and harsh wilderness. Only had one colleague, who we'll call Peter. It's short and easy to remember. Peter was your typical backwater crazy Russian dude who brewed his own vodka and smoked like a chimney. He was my best friend for several years, and always had my back no matter what we faced out there in the woods. The job had shit pay, but it came with loads of perks that made it worth it. We had no boss and could basically just go camping, get wasted, and call it an excursion. I will admit that we once or twice hustled some innocent hunters from their money by claiming that they were poaching. We were corrupt as fuck, but we still managed to make some decent arrests and put some real poachers behind bars. But sometimes, we got calls that required us to do some actual hard work. If people spotted sick animals, it fell upon us to go out there and make sure it didn't spread. If an animal showed aggressive behavior that might endanger the locals, we had to ensure that the animal got put down. We had friends at the local vet who could run blood samples for us if we suspected rabies or something else. One day, Peter and I got a call from some pretty spooked locals. They told us that some boys had gone hunting a couple days ago, but none of them had returned. They believed that they had been killed by bears or wolves. Great. Now we have to venture into the wilderness for some potentially aggressive carnivores. They point us in a general direction and we take off on our ATVs. We drive around the area for about 3 hours when we find an abandoned campsite. It was evident that the camp had been trashed by something, probably a bear. By the looks of it, the boys had left the camp in a hurry, not even bringing their rifles. From then on, we went on foot with our guns drawn, just in case. We found the first corpse, a few meters away from their camp. He was lying on his stomach with several deep wounds to his back. What struck us as odd was that they were deep puncture wounds, which we hadn't ever seen before in a bear or wolf attack. There was a clear path which indicated where the other boys had fled. We found 2 boys in the same small area, both of them lying dead with similar wounds. One of them had practically been gutted. Peter was visibly shaken by the scene and just kept shaking his head in disbelief. According to the locals, there was supposed to be 4 boys out here, so we were still missing one. We both tactically shat our pants when we heard something rustling through the brush moving towards us. We aimed at the commotion and waited for it to reveal itself before we shot. I almost dropped my rifle when it emerged from those dense bushes. It was a red stag with the mangled remains of the 4th boy stuck to its antlers. It had trouble holding its balance under the weight of the boy, but still bellowed aggressively as if it were about to charge us. Peter was the first to snap out of the shock and started lighting the fucking thing up. Upon further inspection, we noticed that its antlers were worn down and broken. It had put an excessive amount of force behind each of its charges, breaking its antlers on the poor boys. The reason the 4th boy was stuck in the antlers was because the damn thing had practically torn through his ribcage. We couldn't separate the boy from the antlers, so we had to bring the head with us. It was one of the most fucked up rides home, with a cargo of several corpses tied to the back of our ATVs. The local authorities were pretty angry at us, seeing as we had moved bodies from a potential crime scene, but let us off easy, seeing as the killer was literally embedded on one of the victims. Seeing the heartbroken parents of these boys still haunts me. That night I hung out with Peter, mostly because I was still pretty spooked. "That shit was unnatural," he said at one point. "Deer can be aggressive and defend against predators, yes. But this fucker hunted down those boys and killed them all. They don't do that shit. That was the first time I caught a glimpse of the spooky shit that goes on out there. In the following years, I saw some deeply insane shit that only Peter and I knew about. I will share the stories with you, and hopefully you will believe me and understand why I'm scared shitless every time I see a deer. About once or twice a month, we had to go on excursions into the wilderness to look for signs of poachers, sick animals, and other stuff like that. One time we decided to drive out to a fairly secluded area because there were rumors of some potential poaching. It was a very, very long drive, so we had always put it off, praying that the poachers would just get mauled by bears so that we didn't have to make the long journey. We had to drive for about 15 hours before the terrain became too difficult for the ATVs to handle. We had to walk the rest of the way, which meant we had to camp out. I was pretty uneasy when night came. Camping out is normal for us, but we were further away from civilization than we had been before, and the previous incident still haunted my mind. Peter offered me a bottle to ease my worries, but I didn't want to be intoxicated in case we were attacked by some demonic deer. The night went by without an incident, but I still didn't get a lot of sleep. We continued on our trek towards the supposed poacher hotspot. We arrived, looked around, but found nothing. There didn't seem to be any sign of human activity anywhere in the area. Yeah, fucking rumors, Peter mumbled to himself as he shook his head in frustration. Normally we should be happy to find nothing, but this time we were just exhausted and cranky. We were then startled by a loud bellowing echoing through the forest. What the fuck was that? Peter pulled out his rifle and aimed in the direction of the noise. Though it went against our instincts, we had to go investigate it. We reached a small ridge that overlooked a clearing. In the middle of the clearing, a group of 5 stags were huddled together. Their heads were bowed down as if they were grazing. We noticed they all seemed to make sudden, violent jerking motions, like they were trying to gore the ground with their antlers. Peter fired a shot into the air, trying to make them scatter. They didn't fucking move. If you have any basic knowledge on wildlife, you know that sudden loud noises make just about any animal take off running. We fired a couple more shots into the air, but they didn't react. In a small moment of madness, we decided to calmly approach them to get a better look at what the fuck they were doing. As we approached them, we were met with a nasty stench of rotten shit. Ugh, is that a fucking bear? Peter gestured at the ground in front of the stags. To our collective bewilderment, there was a large adult brown bear. It was in a stage of decomposition, which meant it had been dead for at least 4 or 5 days. The stags were panting and groaning as they continuously gored the carcass over and over again. They looked seriously malnourished and exhausted. The bear's body was completely ripped apart except for the head, which they for some reason had left completely unscathed. We stood frozen to the ground as we stared at this horrible scene unfold. How the fuck did they take down a bear? How the actual fuck is that possible? I asked Peter. He shook his head in disbelief as he raised his rifle and shot one of the stags. He later explained he wanted a blood sample. As soon as the stag fell to the ground, the others stopped what they were doing and just turned to look at us. They were covered in rotting blood and chunks of meat. They didn't charge or show any aggressive behavior. They just stared at us, unflinching, unblinking. Peter had changed his mind about the blood sample at this point and just slowly started backing away. I followed suit and raised my rifle just in case. When we reached the ridge, they resumed their mauling, once again not paying any attention to us. We were fucking done at this point. We didn't set up camp that night and just kept hiking at a brisk pace until we reached our ATVs. None of us spoke a word the entire ride home, except for the occasional "fuck." That incident really fucked something up in Peter. It took him a couple weeks before he went with me into the forest again. He was completely convinced that the stags were being manipulated by a witch or something, which I'm not really sure of. I don't really believe in witches and all that. I just believe that nature is a lot more fucked up than we believe. We have been away from real, raw nature for so long because we choose to live in cities. We have likely forgotten just how scary and unpredictable it can be. Still, there was something off about those stags. Still don't have an explanation. One day we got a call from the local authorities. Apparently, some old man that lived by himself in a remote cabin had not been seen in a while. They wanted us to take them to the cabin since they weren't used to terrain other than paved streets. We drove them out to the cabin and parked a few meters from the front door. It was already pretty clear that something had happened. The door was completely knocked off its hinges. Cabin was empty. The officers asked us to assist them in their search, and we agreed. The initial theory was that he had been taken away by a bear, which seemed pretty plausible considering the fucked door. We spread out and followed whatever trails we could find. It took about half an hour before one of the officers called something in. He sounded a little shaken, but gave us detailed directions to where he was. He didn't tell us what he had found, but instead said,
"You'll, wanna see this yourselves."
When we reached him, it wasn't clear what he had found, since nothing looked out of place. No broken branches, no trail, no nothing. He just pointed up into a large tree in front of him. Slung over one of the higher branches was a fresh deer carcass. This was certainly odd, but we didn't get what this had to do with the case. Then we noticed something even stranger. Further up the tree, there was a bear carcass. Something had killed a bear and then placed it in the tree. I knew that leopards and other big cats did this for later consumption, but there are no leopards or tigers where this took place. The officers looked uneasy and took nervous glances over their shoulders. We stayed in a group after that and looked around for a couple of hours before we called it. On our way back, we once again passed the tree. The deer was gone, only leaving some bloody branches behind. We picked up the pace and made our way out of there without looking back.